Hi there, everyone. It's Mr. Barden here. I'm going to be going through some information today that I think will be very beneficial moving forward into the next unit. Just a few things before I get into that, though. This video is going to be public, but it's not going to be sharing anything outside of this screen on the screen right now. Basically saying that, hey, if you're in this class, you've got a little bit of an assignment to do. If you're not taking this course with me in the spring of 2021 while I am recording this, you don't have to worry about it. But just look at the assignment on the screen. You're going to watch this video, and then you're going to post some comments, and there you go. This is going to be a real simple assignment that anyone can do between now and the end of the week. The idea is that while it's a testing day when we would normally meet, if you're not testing, watch this during the little 45-minute class period, do your comment, boom, you're good to go. We're ready to move on. All right, outside of that, I think that pretty much covers it. To kind of introduce things, I'm going to be going through the first 2 pages of the sound unit of the textbook. You can check the video description for a link right to this unit, or just go to the normal textbook description that I've posted on all of my PDM videos. So I've got this right here. I'm going to real briefly go through this very first page, just because 1, it's a little shorter, and 2, I'll be talking about this more in other videos and in class. But we'll be utilizing the Tone.js library in this section. So we've been using the P5 library for just about everything. And then in the last unit, we introduced the P5 Play library, and that was a new way to work with sprites and do real-time graphics processing. Now we have the Tone.js library. And inserting it into your sketches are going to be basically the same as how we've done before, with one key difference, one big thing. All right. First off, you'll notice the line's a little longer. That's fine, but basically you can copy this, stick this in your P5 sketch. However, what you're going to have to do is remove the link to the P5 sound library and replace it with this instead of just adding it into the HTML file. Again, I'll go over that, and you can check that out on your own after going through this video, but basically the short of it is that P5 Sound, that's the native sound library, utilizes a lot of what Tone does. So if we use Tone and P5 Sound in the same sketch, they're going to fight each other and nothing's going to work. So we're going to remove P5 Sound and just put in normal Tone. There we are. I've got a little practice assignment for making your own template if you want to make a template that already has everything up and going. That's basically that. Moving forward, I've written this page of the textbook as kind of a basic overview of just how sound works in general, and then how it works specifically with computers. So the whole point of this video will be going through all of this information. I'm going to summarize it a bit. I'm not just going to sit here and read it directly because that's really boring. But the key points that are important to know, and that's why I'm going to make this video public, just because I think this is great things to know. So I'm just going to make this out there and available for everyone who needs to know how sound works or how computers think about sound. It's great to know. If you're taking the sound design course, don't worry, you'll get a lot more of a in-depth explanation of all this, because that's kind of the basis of the course. So you'll get to learn a lot more about what's going on. So let's get into this. So sound is composed of waves. All right, that's kind of at the base level. And I'll have a diagram. We can kind of see part of it on the screen, kind of going through this. But these waves travel through something until they reach your ears or a microphone or something is able to receive them and interpret them. The speed at which these waves travel can vary depending on what it's going through. I'm not going to go through everything, but generally speaking, air is 331 meters per second, approximately. It can vary from depending on the temperature of the air and stuff like that. We don't need to get too much into that. One thing I just want to point out, I've listed a bunch of other um, things here that sound travels through sometimes, and the speed that's been measured going through those things. What's important to notice is that the denser the material is, the faster sound travels through that. And that might seem a little weird, but when you break down what the waves are, which we'll do in a second, basically because the molecules of that thing are closer together as opposed to being farther apart, they're going to bounce into the next one quicker and transfer the wave faster and faster. So something really dense like steel is going to be sound's going to travel a lot faster than through water, or in the case of space, it's so not dense that sound just doesn't travel in space. So you have that right there. So let's look at this diagram right here. We can kind of see the waves being formed. So if someone hits the drums, then we go through and you can notice that air kind of will compress in a wave, and then it'll spread out and compress again in another wave. And we see this represented in the waveform diagram. So essentially, when you look at these diagrams, you'll see that as the line goes up, the molecules of the air at that spot are getting more closely pushed together into the wave compression. And then as it goes down, they're spreading back out. And then a little further down the wave, the other molecules are now bumping into each other and spreading out, and so on and so forth. We can see this again in this diagram right here. So basically, something's making a sound, and we get the loose air molecules. They've essentially pushed all into each other. And since these molecules have bumped into them, they're going to then get pushed forward and bump into these and bump into them, and it forms these waves that eventually hit our ears. I'm not going to play the video right now, partly because my computer is not set up to do that. But if you're checking out this page, you can check out this video. Basically, humans can hear sounds from approximately 20 to 20,000 hertz. Now, hertz, or Hz, is just a measurement for times per second, right? So that means that these little waves are reaching your ears at a rate of between 20 and 20,000 times every second. It's a lot of waves. This is an approximate range. It can change based on age, receptivity, even the shape of your head, but this is an approximate average range for people. I've got this video here again if you want to check it out on your own, and it basically just goes through a full spectrum frequency sweep, so you can listen to it. Don't really recommend listening on headphones because it can get a little grating at times, but if you have some decent speakers, you should be able to hear most of it. If you're listening on very poor quality speakers, you may not hear stuff until you start getting to around 50 or 100 hertz, but eventually it will peter off. All right, perceiving the pitch. So this frequency is a great way to measure sounds. If we're listening to something at exactly 432.5 hertz. Cool. But what are you going to do with that information? A lot of times on keyboards, you'll see that each keyboard note has a specific note name and an octave. This is a much more common way to look at frequencies of sounds as notes. It's a little more accepted by a lot more people. People understand what's going on. You can very easily just refer to things by the frequency, but you're going to have to do some math to figure out some of these relationships. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just going to recommend, if it's easier, use this kind of notation. So basically, you'll notice listening to this, it kind of cycles through perceived pitches. That's why we get, C1, C2, C3, C, and so on and so forth. So essentially, every time the frequency doubles, we have perceived the pitch as moving up one octave. And I've got this illustrated here on a vertical keyboard, whereas A0, way down here at the bottom of the keyboard, is 27.5 hertz. All right, we bump up to A1, we're over here at 55 hertz, twice that. A2, 110, A3, 220, A4, 440, and so on and so forth. Just know that if you're only moving a frequency by a little bit of numbers while working in this program, that may not be that much, because adjusting things by 100 hertz down here in the base range will make a big difference. But if you're way up at the top, where the difference between E and F is over 1,000 hertz, you're not going to be able to tell any difference. So just keep that in mind. All right. Volume. You'll notice if you watch that video that the perceived volume of the note tends to change. Humans hear frequencies better in different range. We tend to pick up them the best right around the frequencies where people speak. Just tends to make sense. That's what we hear most of the time. I've just got a graph here that kind of represents how that frequency, if you hear a note here at the same volume as you heard a note over here, you're going to hear the lower one as being much louder. That's that. We don't need to go more into that right now. Amplitude. Amplitude is another way of kind of talking about the volume of the sound. So if the frequency is the number of waves hitting your ears every second, the amplitude is the size of the waves. So one way to think about it is, if I'm going to talk very quietly like this, I'm going to be pressing a lot less air out of my mouth than if I was going to talk a bit louder like this. So again, louder sounds push more air, creating bigger waves, and you can just hear them as louder. I've got just a little chart here showing some different sound levels and about where they rank. Again, these vary. These are just approximate, but one thing to note is that anything kind of above this 80 to 100 decibels, you start getting into kind of painful sounds. Like this will eventually hurt your ears if you listen to things that are too loud. It's also important to note that if you listen to something at, not quite painful levels for a long time, it could still potentially hurt and damage your hearing. So be careful. Okay. So I've talked about how humans kind of hear things going on. I've said how sound waves travel, they hit your ears, they hit the microphone, and stuff happens. But how does that actually work? This next section is going to go over some of the biology. So let's say we've got these sound waves, and they're traveling through the air, and they hit your ears. The outside of your ear, called the pinna, this is going to help filter them into your ear canal. Right? And the sound waves are going to keep traveling and bouncing, and eventually they're going to hit your eardrum, also called the tympanic membrane. This is, again, inside of your skull. This membrane, that's why it's called the eardrum, it's like a drum head, a membrane, is connected to a few bones right here, 3 different ones, all connected, and they serve to funnel those vibrations down into your inner ear. All right. And we have this thing called the cochlea. Let's see if I have here's a slightly better picture of it. This is a organ that's rolled up on itself, okay? And it's essentially filled with fluid and little nerve endings, almost like little hairs. And these are going to pick up sounds in different spots of the organ depending on the frequency of the sound. It acts like a natural filter inside of your head. So if I'm making a very high-pitched sound, it's going to stimulate nerves over here in this part of the organ, whereas if I went and talked really low, it would pick up these lower frequencies down here, kind of in the middle where it's all curled up. And depending on which part of the organ gets stimulated, different nerves activate and transfer that information into your brain. That's why this sounds a lot different than this when you're hearing it. All right, it's just different nerves are being physically activated in your head. So that's essentially how that works. It's how you hear stuff. So moving on, just for the sake of time, I'm trying to keep this video under 30 minutes. let's talk about how computers represent or can talk about and receive sound. Um, so a microphone, I have this one right here, is essentially a digital ear. All right, it receives sounds and it's able to transform them into electricity that the computer will eventually be able to process. So there are a few different kinds of microphones. I'm not going to go through the details of how all of them work right now, but basically they all in some way receive, I'll keep this diagram on here, receive some sound waves and uh, convert it into electricity that then travels down the wires and then is eventually picked up by the electronic equipment. You can look more into this difference if you want. For the purposes of this course, we don't need to get too much into that. Just know that microphones receive the sound vibrations. In fact, we can actually see in here, it's kind of like the inner ear where all of that happens. So you can kind of hear all of that. It's getting transformed inside of this apparatus, converted to electricity, and then it's a little hard to see on my screen, but it's being sent out the wires here into my computer. I'm going to put the little noise filter back on. All right. Let's keep going. So once this has been transmitted into electricity, again, each microphone works slightly differently. We have to record the sound in order to be able to use it in the computer, especially in this course where we'll be starting off by loading in sounds just like we had loaded in pictures and being able to play them back and change them. Well, the way we do that is by taking a sample. If you remember, or just didn't know, I'll just mention it here. This stream of electricity is a constant, stream of electricity. It looks like a lot like the sound waves before us, just kind of moving between positive and negative voltages. The computer can't really process that, though. It needs a string of numbers in order to work. Right, that's just how computers work. They don't work in abstract ranges. It's just zeros and ones. So to do that, we have what's called an analog to digital converter, sometimes called the ADC for short. And essentially what this does is it looks at the incoming electricity from your microphone and essentially takes a snapshot. It saves what that electricity level is at as a number. And then a little bit later, it takes another one and another one and another one. And essentially is able to recreate the sound in the computer by feeding it this string of numbers. And we can then save that string of numbers. And that's essentially what a sound file is. There's a little more to it, but basically that's what it is. So the computer, generally, the average, does this 44,100 times every single second. That's a lot. So you can notice in a lot of high def things, this can go up to 2 or 3 times that, just a lot higher. But that does make the sound files a lot bigger because it's just more numbers. But just know that the computer is doing that over and over again. I've got this picture I unintentionally highlighted here, and we can see kind of highlighted in the background is a sound wave, and the computer is taking samples every now and then. All right, so go away. So that's basically that. The bit depth is another important thing. So again, the computers work in discrete numbers, ones and zeros and things like that. They don't do very well with, analog or floating point data in the sense that we're working with it right now. So when we take these samples, the computer is essentially assigning whatever the voltage is at to the closest little shelf it can put it in. So it can be like, oh, we're at 5 right here, and 6 is the closest here, back at 5, 0. It's taking a screenshot and putting it in the closest spot it can, and so on and so forth. You may hear bit depth referred to as almost like the resolution of the sound. The more bit depth there is, the more accurate the computer is able to recreate this sound. I've got this diagram here kind of showing how here's an analog sound coming in. It's all smooth. And then as the bit depth increases, it becomes a more and more accurate representation because there's more places the computer can accurately categorize each sample. So if we have 3 bits, there's very few options here. As we move on to 5 and 6, there's a lot more, so we can get a much more accurate reading. Generally, for getting the standard CDs, the bit depth is 16 bits, but just like with sample rates, you can go higher to 24 or 48. But just like with increasing the sample rate, increasing the bit depth also makes the files much larger because there's just more information in each file. All right, moving on to audio pathways. So I'm going to keep using this analogy of a stream almost, okay? And that'll be kind of how I talk about audio pathways. So think of this as sound waves. It's traveling. It's a continuous thing to the microphone. It gets converted into electricity, and that's a continuous stream, and then gets sent to the computer where it's converted into a long series of numbers. Well, for the computer to do anything, and for us to be able to hear that back, we have to then listen to that series of numbers as a stream. You can't just say, here's the number. It reads them in sequence and outputs things as needed. So by sending this stream and kind of feeding the beginning of it from one thing into another and into another, we can connect them around. And that'll be what we do when we start applying different audio effects later in the chapter. So we'll be able to say, hey, here's our sound file. Let's connect it and run the stream from here to the reverb, to the delay, to the the phaser out to the output. You're feeding the sound source from A to B to C. It's a connection of materials. So that's generally how that goes. And each of those things is kind of like an algorithm. It's going to change the numbers up, change the sound. Again, I'm going to go more over that in detail, but just know that from this point, once we have got the sound file, we just read it back, but we can send it from one device to another, and essentially form a little river of sound in our computer. The very end of these audio pathways is going to be the digital to analog converter. So just like computers can't really hear and process electricity, we cannot hear and understand a bunch of numbers like audio. So just like we had the analog to digital converter, we have the digital to analog converter, which works the same way, just backwards. It takes in the number and outputs a voltage of electricity that gets sent out a wire to a speaker. So it does that. So we send it a constant stream, and it outputs a different voltage. To update that stream, voltage looks like a wave. It goes to the speaker. It turns that electricity into sound waves. A really brief oversimplification of this is if you have the magnets here, as you send electricity through a wire, it's going to disrupt the magnetic level, and it's going to cause the coil to move back and forth. If you connect that to this the speaker cone here, the movement back and forth is going to push the air and generate the sound waves. That'll then travel through the air, and you hear them. That's very briefly how speakers work. I will play this one just because you can visibly see that the speaker is pushing the paint. If you want to check this out on your own, again, check this out on your own, and you can listen to it. But I'm just going to real briefly play through part of this. Jump up ahead. There we are. So at this point, the speaker is receiving large amounts of electricity. And in high def, we're going to see now that the speaker is moving back and forth, and it's pushing the paint. It's essentially doing that to the air as well. All right, I'm going to move on. Check out all of that on your own. It's really fascinating. The last thing I'm going to talk about is going into the last section of this course, and this is just sound synthesis. Not necessarily pre-recording stuff, but being able to generate audio from the computer that you then hear. So basically, it's just instead of giving it the computer, you just tell it how to make the string of numbers itself. And then this will get sent out just like normal audio playback that I've already talked about, eventually converted into something and then played back as voltages, and we can hear them, and there you go. Generally speaking, the computers can make 4 basic shapes of these waves. Once they're converted into electricity, we get the sine wave, which is the gradual curved slope between the high and low. Square just jumps between high and low. Triangle is a direct linear movement, and sawtooth moves up or down and then jumps, as you can kind of see right here. By combining these in different ratios, we can create different sounds. By sending them through different effects, we can change how they look, so that way this doesn't just sound like a boring doo when it's converted into electricity and sent out to the speakers, and we can hear it. All right. One last little thing is talking about the ADSR of a synthesizer, right? So I'll talk a little bit about here the adding up the different sounds and ratios, and you can filter them. That's the different kinds of synthesis. I'm not going to go into that here for the sake of time, but we'll talk about it in the course. But just know that you can also shape how your custom sounds sound. So again, this is a constant stream of numbers and data in the computer. So if we were to just listen to that, it would be the sound just exists forever. That's not going to sound very natural. So we can apply what's essentially a filter on the volume that says, hey, when we say play this note, we're going to ramp up the volume, and you get this kind of attack peak here. So it's kind of like a duh, duh, and then so you're going to sustain the note for however long. So duh, and then fade it out. You can customize all these things so you can get really short or really long attacks and releases, and sustain is for whatever you want it to be. But this is just going to be an important thing to keep in mind when we get into talking about synthesizers, because just otherwise it's going to not sound anything like you like it. So you can get the timbre of the sound however you want, with all the different effects and filters and different kinds of waveforms, adding them all together. But if you need to add in the what is called the ADSR right here, the attack envelope, also, in order to make it sound like a musical note. And that's kind of where we'll be wrapping this one up. So this is kind of an overview of the concepts needed for the whole unit. So if some of that didn't make a ton of sense, that's okay. I'm going to be making some videos going forward. At the time I'm recording this, I actually have videos going all the way through this first kind of section here, getting into some audio effects next, and we'll be moving on from there. And then we'll get into synthesizers. Synthesizers is a whole big thing, and moving on to some final sound events. So that kind of summarizes all of that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. If you have any recommendations for things that you think I may have forgotten or should include in this page, let me know. I can very easily update the textbook pages.